That looks good. Yeah, very good.
Yeah, you go. Oh, good. Okay.
Very good. Yeah.
That's even a little larger than needed.
Oh, excellent.
No,
Yeah,
it's perfect. It's just perfect. Yeah.
yeah, you know, I do think phones work really well. Oh, we're recording, so let's start reading. And if in turning the leaves of the supplement, one finds pages here and there with few souls of interest, I guess I should say this is recording civilization or chaos, or the other way around, I forget. And if, in turning the leaves of the supplement, one finds pages here and there with few souls of interest, one may infer how much more tedious were the hours and days of labor of Baba and his men spent in searching out these minor souls. Saints who are consciously aware of their spiritual progress are perhaps not so hard to find, but great musts are gems wrapped in the rubbish of an outer packing of eccentricity and physical dirtiness. And it needs the skill and vision of the master, not only to pierce the veil of trivialities, but also to separate the real jewels from plausible fakes. Dr. Donkin observes that his book possesses, quote, one irremediable defect, that it shows nothing of the invisible spiritual interplay between the consciousness of the master and the minds and souls of the inmates. Parentheses, in the ashrams for the mad, close parentheses. For that, we are circumscribed by Baba's own statement that his relationship with musts is a matter between him and them. So like an iceberg, we see only the eighth part that stands above the surface of the ocean, and the submerged 7/8, the real mass of the thing, is hidden from our eyes, end quote. I presume that the avatars have sometimes worked with the musts prior to a new spiritual dispensation to release the flow of spiritual energy. The only information that I have been able to elicit from Baba is that, quote, a few avatars and some sadgurus and kutubs, such as the Guru Nanak and Khaja Sahib of Ajmer, did work with the musts. I think the Guru Nanak started Sikhism. Not sure though. Without trespassing on arcanic preserves, I think we may surmise that the musts are reservoirs of spiritual energy, the essence of God. And when the avatars work on these spiritual containers, perhaps they are, in some manner we know not, by means of their secret technique, canalizing the divine energy for the regeneration of mankind. Since the musts do appear to be focusing points for the accumulation of divine energy, eventually to be directed in a great outpouring of the Spirit upon our distressed planet. End quote, or begin another quote. And it shall come to pass in the last days, saith God, I will pour out my Spirit upon all men, and your sons and your daughters shall prophesy. Your young men see visions, and your old men dream dreams. Marian, could you unmute if you're muted and continue reading, please?
Chapter 10, Karma. As a universal divine manifestation always coincides with the spiritual renaissance of man, so the period nearing that stupendous event is always one in which humanity is suffering from the agony of approaching rebirth. It is not sufficiently realized that the internal and external significance of this cosmic springtime means, amongst other things, the manifestation reacts not only to the good and bad sanskaras, those are impressions past and present, of individuals, but also to the collective karma or destiny of a country or nation. The direct divine influence can bring about great changes in world affairs, causing the rise and fall of nations and of economic systems, in keeping with their karma, as may suit best the divine plan as a whole. Towards this goal, statesmen, politicians, and great men in public life are more directly, though unconsciously, influenced to bring about the adjustment of social and economic life. All human suffering, whether individual or collective, caused by wars or great natural catastrophes, is neither accidental nor coincidental, for man has to conform to the law which governs the universe. It would be difficult to see any sense or significance in life or to recognize an ordered creation if we did not believe in the law of cause and effect. Without this belief, we would see no justice in life at all. For some are born rich and others poor, some cripples and others strong. There have been events in history in which God has seemed to favor evil rather than good. But in reality, it was not so. As there is always a plan and a purpose behind everything in the cosmic scheme. Take, for example, the historic case of the gallant men of Melos, who refused to desert their good neighbors, the Spartans. The men of Melos thought their cause was just and honorable, and that the gods would therefore surely side with them. They were mistaken. The Athenians had their revenge, destroyed their city, killed all the men, and sold the women and children into slavery. There must have been a number of reasons for this tragedy, impossible for us to fathom. One may suppose that the men of Melos were reaping what they had sown in a previous incarnation, and that the Athenians were paying off a karmic debt. But the judgment of men upon what is good and evil is not always the judgment of God. In an age which has forgotten chivalry and the golden rule, the free world today is faced with the soul-searing problem of action and resistance to evil. The words of Krishna to Arjuna should be of comfort. The bravest of the brave stood hesitating on the battlefield of Kurukshetra, in great distress of mind that he should be forced to slay his unworthy kinsman, he protested, quote, "My limbs fail me, my hair standeth on end, and my whole body trembles with horror and dismay." Krishna rebuked him, telling him he was being false to his own dharma, and that, quote, "the sin that is committed by killing one who does not deserve to be killed is as great as the sin of not killing one who deserves to be killed," end quote. And there was an
Should we look at this?
asterisk after dharma. This is connected to dharma. Footnote, and it's a quote. "Every Brahmin is asked to respect ahimsa, yet the system provides for a class of warriors, kshatriyas, whose profession it is to kill and be killed. When submission to evil is wrong, when resisting it by love is impossible, then it is the duty, meaning dharma, of the warrior class to resist aggression by force." It's closing that quote, and another quote. "The term dharma stands for all those ideals and purposes, influences and institutions that shape the character of man, both as an individual and as a member of society." Close the quote, and in parens is Radhakrishnan, close paren.
Okay. Do you see where we are?
I can reread, starting with that quote about the sin
Awesome.
when I start there. Krishna rebuked him, telling him he was being false to his own dharma. We had that footnote. And that, quote, "the sin that is committed by killing one who does not deserve to be killed is as great as the sin of not killing one who deserves to be killed," close quote. "For when submission to evil is wrong, then it is one's duty to resist evil by force. Jesus certainly taught, quote, 'resist not evil,' end quote. The principle of nonviolence, ahimsa, but his teachings in that respect were only applicable to the problems of his age and not to the problems of our age. Now we must follow action and resistance to evil without hate and out of a sense of duty." Quote, "Stand up, Parantapa, and fight." Close quote. We cannot compromise with deliberate aggression and slavery. Behind the Iron Curtain, the basic freedom of being allowed to live where one likes is forbidden. This is what distinguishes a free man from a slave. Peaceful coexistence with the Iron Curtain is therefore impossible. It matters not if we all lose our lives fighting. What matters is our salvation in our next life. And this is conditioned by what we do in this life. If we could but realize that we shape our future life by the actions of our present life, that, quote, "an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth," close quote, and, quote, "turning the other cheek," quote, apply equally to the laws that govern life. According to the law of cause and effect, if a man commits a murder in one incarnation, his victim will probably kill him in the next. One wonders what karmic debt the Crusaders had to pay for killing every man, woman, and child in Jerusalem. But of all the crimes committed by man, is there anything greater than the action of dictators who have uprooted millions of people from their native soil and transported them to Siberia's icy wastes, where none can live for long. Behind the Iron Curtain, the blood of millions cries out for vengeance. This quote, "Vengeance is mine, saith the Lord." End quote. And in the Lord's own time, evil men will expiate their crimes. All debts and credits must be cleared in one life or another, on earth, in hell or heaven, before one can discover life as it really is, the eternal fountain of divine love, the supreme law. Ordinarily, a person is not killed by an avatar or a perfect master, but there are exceptions, as in the case of Ram and Krishna, who are said to have slain many of their enemies. The spiritual connection between a perfect master and his enemy is very significant of the ways of God. Just as a perfect lover remembers constantly the master, so do the enemies of the master entertain a constant enmity towards God when personalized as an avatar or perfect master. In fact, their remembrance, although in enmity and hatred, is as constant as that of the perfect devotee of God. Quote, "They also remember me, and their internal minds are ultimately combined with the same God." End quote. And there's a footnote that says, Srimad Bhagavata, the epic story of the life of Lord Krishna by Vyasa, Act 10, Chapter 44. So said Krishna, and he explained whatever is uppermost in the mind of a dying person, his next life is conditioned thereby. In the final end, he comes face to face with God, or his, so with a capital H, his incarnation, in the form of the avatar, and dying in his thought, attains to heaven. There is nothing illogical about this. God harbors no ill will or grudge against an enemy in the sense we mortals do. Once a man is punished for his vile acts, the chapter ends. Death, after all, is the best leveler. It is said that Kansa, the demon king who was slain by Krishna, used to think constantly of him with extreme agitation, fear, and hatred. Eating, drinking, sleeping, walking, speaking, or breathing, that is, at all times, he used to see the Lord as if he was present before him. Due to this constant remembrance, in holding the thought of Krishna, even though it was in enmity, he attained to salvation, meaning God realization. There's a footnote. For elaboration of this idea, see the Ramayana of Tulsidas. The doctrine of karma has always prevailed in the East in some form or other. In fact, free will or law by karma is a subject about which many volumes have been written. The question of whether exertion or destiny is greater has yet to be answered rationally. The masters are undoubtedly above the law, but it is a well-known fact that, except in rare cases, they generally remain within the law as fully known to them, even to the extent of getting their bones broken in accidents or of being tortured and murdered. The many points of karma are too complicated, and we are not competent to deal with them. But we should always remember that the perfect men are always beyond Maya, or rather, that Maya does not exist for them, even as an illusion. When trying to explain a problem beyond the capacity of the human intellect to grasp, one can only say, like Meher Baba, quote, "It cannot be fully intelligible yet," close quote.
Thank you, Marian. Gloria, could you unmute if you're muted and continue, please?
Yes, thank you. I have often wondered, when catching the behavior of men, animals, and birds, how they can do these things so naturally and easily if they had not been performing the same actions for millions of years. Surely unconscious behaviorism must be the result of, quote, "the sediment of all experience in the universe of all time, and also an image of the universe that has been in process of formations for untold ages," end quote. Footnote. Note, the house that Freud built, Jastrow. We know those who study astrology declare that the celestial pattern of terrestrial forms is primarily based on the influence exerted by past lives. And certainly we must admit that the theory of reincarnation does explain so many of life's mysteries otherwise inexplicable. Footnote. Note, the Honorable Ralph Shirley has given circumstantial evidence of former lives. The Honorable Ralph Shirley has given circumstantial evidence of former lives in his book, The Problem of Rebirth. We know that children sometimes have strong recollections of a former life, but in the West, no heed is paid to their, quote, fairy tales. But in the East, they are listened to, and there are some famous and authenticated stories where remembrance of a previous life has been confirmed. In the West, a few writers like Mark Twain and others have obtained glimpses through dreams or by some other means of incidents which can only be explained by this theory. Footnote. See The Mysterious Stranger and Other Stories by Mark Twain. Socrates said that, quote, "all knowledge was only remembering," end quote, and some of the Greek philosophers undoubtedly regarded the belief as a self-evident truth. At one time, it was a widely accepted belief of the Jews and certainly many of the early Christians. Early Christians held the doctrine, especially Origen, who declared that, quote, "every man received a body for himself according to his deserts in former lives," quote, end. The disciples of Jesus believed that John the Baptist was Elijah, but gradually the church suppressed such ideas as heretical for reasons too obvious to elaborate. In the Gita, the argument is detailed by Krishna, quote, "a thing imaginary has no existence, while that which is true is a stranger to non-entity. The wise, therefore, neither grieve for the dead nor for the living. For the wise know that as a man threweth away old garments and putteth on new, Even so, the soul, having quitted its old mortal flames, entered into others which are new. Never did I not exist, nor thou, not all the princes of the earth, nor will any one of us ever hereafter cease to be. As the soul in this mortal frame findeth infancy, youth, and old age, so in some future frame will it find the like. One who is confirmed in this belief knows that the contacts of the senses give beat and cold, pleasure and pain, which come and go and are transient and inconstant, while the soul, though invisible, is inconsumable and incorruptible. For the soul is not a thing of which a man may say it hath been, is about to be, or is to be hereafter, for the simple reason that is a thing without birth, surpassing all conception. Both I and thou, therefore, have passed many births. Mine are known to me, but thou knowest not of thine. End quote. The popular term for karma is fate. In truth, however, we really create our own destiny, which we have shaped as good, bad, or indifferent in our former lives. But just as we have shaped it in the past, so also can we shape it in the future, provided we have some understanding of the laws in operation, enabling us to modify or remold the course of our future life. The law of karma is inherently just and moral, even though we may not be able to appreciate this truth because we may not have benefit in the way we wish. Here, some may ask, quote, why do we not all retain memory of past lives? Mercifully, a veil is drawn over past experiences, the memories of which are stored in the mental body of the individual soul. When we are born again into a new physical body, we also take a new brain, and in ordinary circumstances, the brain acts as a curtain which completely shuts out all experiences connected with our past lives. It is not necessary for most of us to know about our past existences. Our spiritual development depends on our present intuitive faculties, which help us to adjust ourselves to constantly changing situations in life. If our minds were clogged with past impressions, it would be far more difficult. Some may also ask, quote, what happens in the period between our early lives? Quote ends. Footnote, see appendix, after death conditions. If all action is based on thought and the power of thinking, then our thoughts in action are bound to influence the world at large, for good or evil. It is thought that patterns the shape of things to come. Esoteric literature gives many examples of how a man's life has been affected by the misdeeds of a former incarnation. Max Handel's book, Message of the Stars, gives convincing testimony of such cases. Not only do our lives here on earth react to the thoughts we create, but we thereby influence our future lives also, and our life in the subtle and mental worlds as well. This inexorable truth was revealed in a dreadful form to Max Handel, who could look into a person's former incarnation to explain his present difficulties. The problem of karma and reincarnation seems to be one unending tangle, unless reviewed in the light of spiritual truths. So we will give an extract from the discourses of Meher Baba. Quote, the intermittent incarnations in the gross world are only apparently disconnected. Karma persists as a connected link and determining factor through all the lives of the soul. The law of karma and its manner of operation cannot be fully intelligible as long as the gross body and the gross world are considered to be the only facts of existence. Karmic determination is made possible by the existence of subtle and mental bodies and worlds. Quote end. Another quote, the plane on which one can possess physical consciousness is the gross world. The planes on which the soul can have subtle and mental consciousness are the subtle and mental worlds. Quote ends. New quote, the source of desire is to be found in the mind, which is related to the mental plane. Here the seed of desire is attached to the mind. The desire exists here in an involved form, just in the same way as the tree is latent in the seed. The mental body, which is the seat of the mind, is often called karma sharira, or the casual body, because it stores within itself the seeds of the causes of all desires. The mind retains all impressions and dispositions in a latent form. The limited I, or the ego, is composed of these sanskaras. However, the actual manifestation of sanskaras in consciousness, as expressed through different mental processes, takes place in a subtle body. End quote. New quote. The soul, which in reality is one and undifferentiated, becomes apparently individualized through the limitations of the mental body, which is the seat of the ego mind. The ego mind is formed by the accumulated impressions of past experiences and actions, and it is this ego mind which constitutes the kernel of existence of the reincarnated individual. The ego mind, which is a reservoir of latent impressions, is the state of the mental body. The ego mind, becoming a spirit and experiencing activated and manifested impressions, is the state of the subtle body. And the ego mind, as descended in the gross sphere for created action, is the state of a physical incarnation. Thus, the ego mind, which is seated in the mental body, is the entity which has all the phases of continued existence as a separate individual until it is completely dissolved into higher life. End quote. New quote, the ego mind, which is seated in the mental body, takes lower bodies according to the impressions stored in it. These impressions determine whether a person will die young or old, whether he will experience health or illness, or both, whether he will be beautiful or ugly, whether he will suffer from physical handicaps like blindness or will have general efficiency on the body, whether he will be pure or impure of heart, fickle or steadfast in will, and whether he will be immersed in the pursuit of material gains or will seek the inner light of the spirit. End quote. Quote, the ego mind is in its turn becomes modified through the deposited impressions of karma, which includes not only gross and physical actions, but thought and feeling. And the circumstances of each incarnation get adjusted to the composition and the needs of the ego mind. Thus, if a person has developed certain social capacities or tendencies in one incarnation, he takes them on to the succeeding incarnations which follow. Through the persistence of impressions, the karmic links which have been forged in one incarnation and carried on and developed in succeeding incarnations, so that those which have been closely associated with each other through good or bad dealings have a tendency to have recurring contacts. and carry on the game of duality far enough to gather so much experience of the opposite that the soul, out of the fullness of its experience, eventually becomes ripe for dropping the ego mind and turning inwards to know itself as the oversoul, end quote. The ways of masters and initiates in the East appear strange and incredible at times to Westerners who have had no previous experience of them. Their idiosyncrasies, their eccentricities, their absolute disregard of any previous arrangement which they may have made, the rapid and inexplicable changes and alteration in their plans, conduct, agreements, and so forth. Such acts tend to produce adverse impressions in many who meet them, but the masters work in accordance with the law of cause and effect. Needless to say, intimate followers live under very trying conditions at times. Here we should always try to realize that our limited viewpoint sees things only as they are from the objective standpoint. We have to understand that our minds know nothing of the inner technique or subjective work done by the masters, who are often engaged in, quote, tricking Maya, quote, so that we are hardly in a position to judge or criticize those who have transcended all human limitations, being beyond the domain of karma and Maya, and those established, quote, above the law, end of the quote, of mind and matter. The wheel of life and death no longer turns for them. They are the great compassionate ones who voluntarily reincarnate for the sake of the world to perfect humanity. This perfect man, being in direct touch with all the spheres of inner consciousness, work along many avenues of which we know nothing. This secret unknown approach can only be fully apprehended by self-realized men. They work for infinite ends, and infinite ends must necessarily be very different from the finite ends which govern ordinary limited individuals.
Thanks, Glo. Miguel, could you continue reading, please?
A disciple's relationship with his master is very different from his relations with others. His connection with his master is governed by his former associations in past lives. For when a master takes an incarnation, he calls those who have been associated with him in former lives. This calling by the master is not usually effected by purely natural means. It is generally a secret process, the disciples being drawn to the master by an unaccountable and unconscious magnetism, which he will be unable to explain. He may be blown along as if by the wind, unconscious and yet sure. In many cases, there will have been some subjective process, as when the master may appear in a dream, either as himself or in some symbolical form. Or again, there may have been some spiritual experience or some chance meeting in which the aspirant feels the recognition of his soul and knows intuitively that there is some deep connection with the master, and that henceforth his whole life will be completely changed by this one predominating factor. By this one predominating factor. This new spiritual relationship, which overshadows all previous events and all the former relationships of his life. Spiritual development consists in the gradual emancipation of consciousness, the mind having been entangled in the bindings of the sanskaras, which have accumulated from past lives. A master who receives unstinted devotion and service from a devotee is able to wipe out many of the sanskaras which impede the aspirant's progress along the path towards self-realization. We shall here make some reference to the Quran, since explanation of the theory of reincarnation is noticeably absent from it. According to Muslim usage, God's word is Quran, and Muhammad's word or say is Hadith, plural ahadith. A Muslim authority on the Quran writes me that he has not come across any hadiths in support of reincarnation, but that there are several pages in the Quran which, no doubt, cover the facts of evolution and reincarnation. But these particular passages are also capable of being interpreted differently, and as a rule, in the Muslim world, they are interpreted in the sense of the final resurrection or the date of judgment. There is neither categorical admission nor rejection of evolution and reincarnation in the Quran and the Ahadith. To make out a case for evolution and reincarnation from the Quran is not impossible. What one might call, quote, the stalemate, end quote, of reincarnation is practically unknown to the Muslims, who are more positively minded than the Hindus. One of the great Muslim masters, Jalaluddin Rumi, the churchman of Shams, does not mince words about evolution and reincarnation. In his famous Masnavi, he has graphically described them both, and he invariably quotes Quranic words in support of his quote-unquote direct experiences. He says, Mansar Quran Maksa Barthastam Bostulahan Pishai Sagaan and Dalabitam, or some words like that. That is, quote, I have digested the marrow out of the currants and have left over the bones for the dogs, end quote. The Sufis generally refer to worldly-minded people as Sagai Durian, or worldly dogs, with an admiration sign. Millions of Hindus believe in reincarnation, and millions of Muslims do not believe in it. Yet they have both produced a great number of perfect masters, and both have shown the worst in human nature, as we saw recently during the Indo-Pakistan partition. In philosophy, India has had no influence on Arabia. The Hindus worship God through the medium of picturization of the different aspects or attributes of God, whereas the Arabs, before Muhammad came, were idol worshippers, for whom the very idols were God, much the same as fetish worship of backward Africans of today. Some may ask, has not man's evolution always been a very slow process? How do we know? Except for a few thousand years of vague historical records, we know nothing of man's progress through the ages. Moreover, his spiritual evolution must be a debatable point, since there had been perfect men from the days of Adam. Again, one may ask, how can there be a sudden quickening of the spirit on a universal scale as predicted in this book? Our reply is that the masters had been patiently working behind the scenes to bring in the new dispensation. But if so, then what happened in the days of Jesus and Mohammed? We are not competent to do research work on the origins of the Christian and Islamic ages, or to examine historical records so far back. But it has been authoritatively presumed that the Renaissance in the first century of Islamic history, the great and magnificent Umayyad period after Muhammad's passing, was due to his avataric manifestation. But now, in some respects, Islam seems almost back to the conditions prevailing before the advent of Muhammad. In fact, the first chapter of the Quran paints a picture of the present-day Muslim in the same way that Jeremiah prophecies applies to the Christian of today. Certainly, Islam is in great need of the Imam Mahdi to reveal himself once again, to give the Muslim faith a new spiritual orientation, and to revitalize it with a fresh spirit of sympathy and cooperation and service towards mankind in general. The last word and the one before, with all their colossal chaos and misery, to say nothing of the aftermaths, are helping to bring about man's spiritual redemption. For only when man's pride, his conceit of intellect and self-sufficiency of knowledge are humbled by physical and mental suffering, will he at last be prepared to turn in his extremity to God. Quote, the Spirit of truth, whom the world cannot receive, because it seeth him not, neither knoweth him. End quote. The intellectuals cannot see the Spirit with their clouded vision. As Nietzsche wrote, quote, the Spirit is life, which itself cutteth into life. By its own torture does it increase its own knowledge. And the Spirit's happiness is this, to be anointed and consecrated with tears as a sacrificial victim. End quote. The intellectuals turn away from life and seeking after their dead tree of knowledge may become fools in becoming wise. How can we obtain the actuality of real knowledge? Only by the real inner experience. The avatar will give us a fresh awakening of the heart to bring about that spiritual revival necessary for the work of restoration and reconstruction following the coming of evil. The problems of today are so great, so far-reaching, that no statement or combination of a statement can deal with them effectively. For none has the requisite inspiration or spiritual comprehension, which can only come through a superhuman faculty for assisting man in solving his problems. Only divine love can bring about the change that will induce coordination of the mind and heart and give rise to a better balanced personality than that possessed by the average person. This change of heart or rebirth of spiritual perception will enable men to develop the sympathy, capacity, and indeed genius necessary to deal with the almost insoluble questions which bewilder and perplex them. There is no other solution.
Perfect. Page 186, folks. Stop the recording. Okay. There we go.